Well, welcome to all our viewers who are watching this broadcast. My guest today is Hartness Samushonga. Hello, Hartness. How are you?
Hi, Ryan. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Today we're going to have a discussion with Hartness, who is a pastor and a theology scholar, and also the CEO and founder of Bivo Support UK. We're hoping he's going to tell us a little bit about Bivo Support and share some insights into what he describes as bivocational ministry. I believe there's going to be a lot to learn from someone who is not only a bivocational minister, but also someone who is a researcher and has published academically in this area. So, Hartness, let me just start this off by asking you a question. Well, first of all, can you just describe or introduce yourself and tell us what it is you do?
Okay, thanks, Ryan. So obviously, my name is Hartness Samushonga. I am a minister in a local church, so that's my ministerial calling. And alongside that, I am involved in quite a number of things, some which you've already alluded to when you started in the introduction. So I am a pastor in the church, obviously in a leadership function within the church with pastoral responsibilities. But actually outside of church, I'm also involved in other things. So my background is healthcare management. So I am still involved in healthcare management, but also in other entrepreneurial activities around healthcare. In addition to that, I am a researcher and also a theological scholar. I mean, I would describe myself as a practical theologian, but I do have a number of areas that I look at, and one of my interests is actually bivocational ministry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you say then that you're a pastor on one hand, and also a theologian on the other hand, or a scholar, I think, as you put it. Now, some people might think, you've got a lot going on there. Some people might think that there could be tension or conflict coming from trying to do these many things that's going on. How would you answer that?
That's quite an interesting question, Ryan, because I have asked that question myself. In fact, what I would actually say is that previously my view was there was an unhealthy tension because some people, actually, I do have conversations with a lot of people. And interestingly, just last year, I was at a theological conference in Denmark with a number of scholars from particularly around Europe. And we had a discussion over lunch about this particular, I would call it a myth, really, that people think that when people become scholars, they become less spiritual, or they become a bit more detached from reality and faith practice. But my view actually is, if we are typical scholars and if we are typical practitioners, there's actually a benefit in that. I think people do forget that our heroes like Apostle Paul in the New Testament, he was both actually. He was your typical theologian of the day. He was a scholar. I mean, if you look at his writings, really amazing. So there is that benefit. But when you put practice and theory together, that really blends it. Because what I've seen in reality, some people tend to be more one-sided and they lose the benefit of the other side. So just to answer you there, I don't see a tension really, but I actually see I see a blend of something that really brings ministry alive, where it's not just practice that's isolated to theory. I mean, for your own information, the Bible itself, in one sense, yes, it is spiritual, but it's actually theory in itself. So we need to study the Bible. We need to understand. We also need to study other things that exist around the Bible itself. So I'm pretty comfortable being both.
Okay, that's a very, very good answer, and I do happen to agree. I mean, the Apostle Paul, he was a tent maker as well, so he knew a thing about doing many things at once. In terms of theology then. What is your focus when it comes to theology?
Right. So, as I said before, I describe myself as a practical theologian. So, what that means is, there's so many definitions of anything, especially in theology, really. But practical theology is basically, in general terms, is that aspect of theology that constantly reflects on the practice of the church, looking alongside scripture itself, with the hope and the objective really of improving our practices. So I have an interest in a number of things. So one of the areas is bivocational ministry, which is what I believe we're going to talk about a little bit more today. I'm also interested in looking at burnout in pastoral ministry. So from my health background, but also somebody who's interested in pastoral studies, it's an area that I have researched and also published. I'm also interested in diaspora missiology. It basically means people who have migrated from one place to another, just trying to understand the theology around their practices and how that can really be, having dialogue there and see if we can explore a lot of things just to maximize the way we do church or how we live our Christian faith.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you mentioned that phrase in your answer there, the bivocational ministry. And that's probably going to be the main phrase that's going to go alongside this video. And of course, that's what we want to talk to you about. So can you explain to us what it is and just describe what it's all about?
I will try. I'll say I will try because there's obviously no single definition, but I'm going to explain a few things to try and respond to that very important question. So bivocational ministry there is no single definition. In fact, if you go across the Atlantic in the US, there seems to be some common ground on what that means. I mean, they obviously describe it with slight variations, which I will get to as I progress to answer you. So bivocational ministry, in essence, looks at, it describes a type of, or an approach to ministry where a minister is also involved in ministry in the church, but also has another vocation or vocations outside of ministry. So it's bivocational in the sense that there is a ministry vocation, but there's also a vocation that is outside of church. Now, within the context of Britain, we don't particularly use that terminology. As you'd know that a lot of studies around that way of ministry is conducted within the Church of England context. Mm-hmm. And over the years, they have used like 9 different terms to refer to what I describe as bivocational ministry. So as an example, they've used voluntary clergy, they've used honorary ministers, they've used priest workers, and quite a number of terminologies. But currently, I would say the most 3 that are mainly prominent within the context of the UK, which again, as I've said, it will be within the Church of England, because most of the studies have been conducted from that perspective. So there's what they call non-stipendiary ministers. What they mean is that they are not funded by the church. Okay. So they don't receive a stipend from the church. So they're called non-stipendiary ministers. You also have ministers in secular employment. Again, there's debate about what is secular and what isn't within the study of bivocational ministry itself. So that's one of the terminology. But another common terminology used is self-supporting ministry. So, I mean, as you can see that all these terms, they're actually looking and making an attempt to describe ministers who are involved in ministry, but they also have other things going on, another vocation. It might be business, it might be some kind of work that they actually earn their living from. So you have a whole mix there. You have some who are partly paid by the church or partly remunerated by the church, and you have people, some who are purely, like myself, I'm purely self-funding, or I don't get paid by the church. So there's a whole mix. But the idea behind the concept is that somebody has a vocation within the church or ministry within the church. I mean, I use the word church, but again, it can be ministry. Ministry is not always church. It's not what we call ecclesiology, which is within the church. It could be outside. So it's somebody who has a ministry that's ministry-focused vocation, and another, or even more than one, like myself, who has other things going on outside of church. So in a nutshell, that's how I would describe a bivocational ministry.
Okay. Would you say then that it's a new way of doing ministry?
Well, I would say no, with a big no, because I want to take you to the New Testament, right? If we look at Apostle Paul, particularly in the book of 2 Thessalonians, I mean, and right through the New Testament, we can see that Apostle Paul was also involved. He was a leather worker. That was his trade, and which also involved making tents, right? So bivocational ministry over the years has been dubbed as a tent making from Apostle Paul. So I am one of those scholars who hold the view that Apostle Paul himself is the archetype of bivocational ministry. And moving on from there, if you go around AD 270 to 348, you have Spyrindon, who was a bishop who was part of the Council of Nicaea, you know, the group of bishops and scholars, that ecumenical group that sat to discuss issues around the Trinity, some of what we have as our doctrines today. He was a bivocational minister himself. So he was involved in, he was a shepherd in his trade, but he did that alongside his ministry. So many examples. We've got John Chrysostom, who was the Archbishop of Constantinople. He also promoted that. I will also take you to the Apostolic Constitution, which is also called the Holy Apostles, which kind of like guided the apostles around that time, around liturgy and morality. It also promoted that they would. It was a good thing for them to continue with their trade as well as being in ministry. I mean, there's lots of examples during that time of the early church. But in this country, we have the likes of William Carey around mid-18th century. He was an English Baptist minister. He went to India for Christian ministry. He was also an entrepreneur involved in agriculture, but he was also heavily involved in translation of the Bible. Yes. You have Father Kelly, who was originally a Roman Catholic, and then 1860 to 1950, he's actually the founder of the Society of the Sacred Mission of Theological College in 1913. He was involved in setting up churches in Anglican provinces, in overseas mission. You also have popular Roland Allen. He was also an English missionary to China. There is lots and lots. In fact, in 1943, you have the Roman Catholic Church introduced what they called worker priests, who were priests, but who were actually encouraged to go and find jobs that becomes their sort of like primary area for ministry. So it's not a new way of doing ministry. I've given you lots of examples within the UK, but also in the US. There are lots of examples of, particularly within the Baptist movement, right. The Southern Baptists, they've got a very great history of bivocational ministry. So it's not a new way of doing ministry. It started in the New Testament, throughout the early church, and even now is actually becoming even more prominent. In fact, some scholars believe that the default way of doing ministry back in the day was bivocational. Then along the way, things did change, where you had people who were predominantly ministers. So it's quite exciting when you look at the whole history of it.
Would you say then it's common today? I mean, we've got a good history, we can see that. Is it common as a way of ministering today?
It is very, very common. It's unfortunately, which is one of the which I will talk about a bit later. Because I don't want to divert from the question now. It is very common. In fact, in the U.S., particularly in the Southern Baptist, which is arguably the largest denomination in the U.S., one in every 3 pastors is bivocational.
Okay.
And just speaking generally in the US, about 1 in 5. If we come to the UK, because most churches and denominations, they don't keep records and statistics of these things. But as I've said, again, the Church of England is quite good. There are ministry statistics that they publish every single year. The 2018 report, which was published in 2019, there was about 3,000 self-supporting ministers who were within the Church of England, whereas on the other hand you had like 7,000 ministers who were non-bivocational. So it's almost half of that number. So it's quite prominent. It's quite common, yeah, even today.
Good, right. Well, let me ask you this then. What then would you say are the benefits, if any, of being a bivocational minister?
Right. Yeah, I do love that question. Of course, it does come with its challenges, but there are some benefits that come with it. A lot of them have been validated by research. Research not just involving ministers, but involving congregants who have ministers who are bivocational. So some of them, I think for me, which has been echoed in many other places, is that it gives you the independence, the financial independence, because we do realize that ministries have got different capacities, but even outside of capacity, there is that, freedom, financial freedom, that, we've had stories of churches having fluctuating income, and that does affect the income of the ministers. So if you're bivocational, you have other streams of income. It gives you like a steady income. But there are other benefits that are not attached to finances. In fact, there's more reasons than the financial reasons. There's the reasons that there are reports that ministers who are also engaged in another life that's outside of the church, they do bring quite a lot of beneficial ways of doing things within the church itself. So there's research that has shown that having a bivocational minister does enhance ministry, because as an example, you have a minister with managerial expertise. When they come to church, they actually bring that if they've got leadership expertise. So it brings with it those benefits that will benefit the church itself. I said I wanted to move away mainly from the financial aspect, but we can't move away from it, because one of the benefits is that if a minister is self-sustained, it also allows the church to use its funds to do other things. So there are quite a number of benefits, and those are just some of them. And just one more, there's also reports that churches that are led by bivocational ministers, they stimulate the whole church to be actually active in serving, because that's the culture of the church. They see it in the leader, and they know that the leader has other activities. So everybody has to really become active, and that is exactly what the church should be like, because we are called to be Christians, but we are called also to serve. Everybody has to serve. So I would say those are my answers for you for today.
I like your answers. But at the beginning, you mentioned that there are challenges.
Yeah.
To being a pastor and having another job, or being any kind of church leader and having some other vocation.
Yeah.
Can you tell us then about your own experiences in juggling the demands of both spheres of your life?
Yes. I can share with you some of my personal experience. But again, because I've been studying this bivocational ministry for it's about very actively now, about 6 years now. So it's quite interesting to and liberating to realize that my experience is actually mirrored elsewhere. So one of the challenges is actually the demands and the expectation. It might just mirror the same demands and expectations of somebody who is not bivocational. So that I think I would say that's one of the biggest challenges. But also having time that's divided in a number of things. I mean, we speak of bivocational mainly because of two focuses, one that is ministry focused and one that isn't. But in reality, people would have more than two engagements. Like I'm a scholar, that's another life really in itself. I've got other things going on in business, that's another line really. So it's time management. It's either you learn how to time manage more effectively, or you're just going to break down because you have competing demands. But also one thing that I've seen earlier on in my ministry, which I've managed to rectify now, is that there's a danger that you might not have enough time to spend with your family. So if you have a family, of course. So those are some of the key things that I've experienced myself. Also, particularly when you're starting off, sometimes people are not quite sure whether it's the right way to go. Is it biblical? So you could actually have tension within yourself because it depends on what church tradition you're coming from. So I was coming from a church tradition where predominantly, by default, a minister had to leave everything that they're doing and just concentrate on ministry. Of course, I'm not against that. It's another way of doing ministry. But I'm saying if somebody's coming from that background, you might have internal kind of tension, just trying to figure out, is it the right thing or it isn't? So I would say first 1-2 years, I might have been there, but with time, obviously studying, learning, revelation, praying, I soon realized that there's so many ways of doing ministry. So just beyond my personal experiences, because I work with bivocational ministers, I organize meetings for them, do quite a number of workshops with them. Some of the things that come out is that a lot of them feel that they are treated as second-class ministers, particularly within larger denominations. That's some of the things that have come out. I've just finished a research with European Pentecostal scholars. It's a paper that will come out particularly sometime at the end of the year. And they were echoing the same thing, that in a number of areas that bivocational ministers may be considered as a lower grade of minister. So those are some of the disadvantages. But again, as I've said, it depends with context. If you are in America, in the Southern Baptist Church, actually it's more favorable to be a bivocational minister because everybody's talking about it. Everybody's saying, how do we promote this type of people really who have committed themselves to ministry, but also they have all these other demands. So yeah, that's my personal take on that.
Interesting. It's interesting. You did mention that there are many ways of doing ministry. Why then should people be interested in bivocational ministry? What would you say to those people who haven't got a clue what it is?
Yeah.
But in response to why they should know.
Right. So the first thing I would say is that we are called to have a relationship with God as Christians, but also to serve, right? So every Christian, that's my belief, that's what I understand, that's my reading of the Bible. There is a place for you to serve God, right? So for me, that's the fundamental thing there. Everything else of how you're going to do it, that's another level of discussion. So if we take it from that foundation, from that basis, then what that says to me is there's a number of ways of actually doing ministry. Because there are some people who I've encountered who are waiting for the right moment. By right moment, I don't mean that they don't feel the calling. They feel the calling is there. They even feel it's now. Now is the time to do it. But they are thinking financially, because for most of the people in that category, they are thinking about will the church be able to support us, to sustain me? And I'm saying that should really not be the factor that should determine whether we serve or not. Of course, there are challenges, there are financial challenges. Everybody has to evaluate and make an assessment of your own situation. But what I'm saying there is having a job or being in business should not be a hindrance for you to go even into ordained ministry. I mean, if anything, it's actually can be a benefit, really, as I've said before, that you become that person, but with financial independence. So I say to people, as Jesus said, the harvest is plenty, the laborers are few. And we are the laborers, every one of us. If you feel called to that kind of, to minister at that level, leading a church or church planting, or even as in ordained ministry, there should be no finances, should not be a hindrance. And even church tradition really should not be a hindrance. We should rise up above those things to be able to fulfill the calling that God has called us upon our lives. And I'll also add and say to anybody in that situation, if you talk to bivocational ministers, they can share some stories, amazing stories of how people came to God through bivocational ministry, how people experience the supernatural power of God from the ministry of bivocational ministers. So all I'm saying is you can do ministry that way. And there's lots of examples and lots of positive outcomes that have actually being realized as a result.
So you would like people to know more about this so that they can at least consider looking at that as a form of ministry for themselves. Now that's a large undertaking, and that kind of brings us to my next question, because what we really want to ask you about is Bivo support.
Right.
And what that's all about. And I think it's kind of related to what you've already said, but can you give us a bit more information about Bivo support and tell us a little bit about what motivated you, and then what are your aims in going forward with Bivo support?
Right. So, I mean, as I said, I started off as a bivocational minister, which was a totally new territory for me. And as I was doing my master's studies with Moreland School of Theology, I decided to do a project on bivocational ministry. And I was looking at burnout in bivocational ministers. So, right. And as I started studying around the area, looking at my life and looking at other colleagues who were ministering in a similar circumstance, I realized that it's a whole world of practice really that hasn't really been tapped into, but particularly in the context of the UK. I mean, I do give credit to my Church of England colleagues. They have done quite a lot over the years. In fact, I do know some of the scholars who have written around bivocational ministry, but there isn't support in this country, much support. I speak to denominational leaders. I speak to ministers within denominations. In some denominations, it's not even a subject that's being talked about. But if you look at the numbers of bivocational ministers that they do have, it's quite a significant number. So they have a lot of challenges. And one of the challenges I discovered was that a lot of leadership activities, training, took place during the week, because the ministers who are predominantly doing ministry, that's their workplace, and weekend they do take a break. So the bivocational ministers were actually lacking support. There is a huge gap in research on bivocational ministry, which is why I've dedicated part of my scholarly focus on that, because there's actually a lot of gaps there. So, having looked at my experience, when I went to Bible college, there was no mention of bivocational ministry through my 3 years, and then I went to masters. I think there was no mention of it. So when I went into bivocational ministry, the things that I discovered myself, I wish I'd known them many years before, because that would have really helped me. So with all of that in mind, I'm thinking there's quite a lot of people who could benefit from this. Not only the ministers, but also denominational leaders engage. I've started to have conversations with some of them, which for them is actually as if it's something really new, which is really positive, because that was my motivation, that there will be bivocational ministers. They've always been. There will be ministers who are bivocational. There will be some who aren't. But we need everybody to be aware, and particularly with these challenges, they need a lot of support. So that's how the dream, the vision of Bivo support started. So the key things that we focus on is bivocational ministry training and development. So organizing training for bivocational ministers, which is really looking at bivocational ministry itself, how they can progress better in that kind of ministry, giving them the tools to be able to navigate that. I call it a beast because it's a totally different beast. It's a different way of doing ministry. But also looking at mentoring, because I didn't have any mentors who were bivocational ministers. I mean, I did have mentors, but none of them were bivocational. So they didn't quite understand where I was coming from. So I'm thinking I would really want to support, mentor myself, but also raise other mentors who can mentor other people who are bivocational ministers. Also looking at research. I mean, I love research, is also to undertake the research myself, but also engage with other researchers, which I've now started. I've got a good network now, mainly in the US, but some here who are actually interested, so that we can promote, so that we can look deeper into the issues and elements that have to do with bivocational ministry to improve the practice, and also do some consultancy. So I've started consultancy with, as I've said before, with the denominations, because you need a bivocational minister who's walked the journey to be able to support strategies in bivocational ministry within denominations, and also consultations with theological schools. I've recently, well, it'll probably be out next week. I did research with some theological institutes in the UK, looking at theological training within the Bible college itself, because it's actually missing, it's lacking. And what was interesting was that the colleges did admit that a number of their students present and those that have left have gone into bivocational ministry. But there isn't anything in the curriculum that talks about it or helps them to have an insight of what it is. So those are the factors which really stimulated me, because there was a gap, but also those have also become now our mission activities for Bible support. And the other thing that I haven't spoken about yet is funding, sourcing for funding to support bivocational ministers, because some of them do struggle. So it's helping with their personal development, but also helping them with small grants where we are able to do it. Obviously, based on the circumstance, and it will be means tested. So that's my vision, and I'm glad that we've already started to do a lot of that. I mean, we're still building. We only started last year, and last year we had a good conference in London. It was at the London School of Theology. So this year, because of COVID-19, we decided to use this year to progress a lot of things, so that hopefully in the near future we can actually start events, either virtual or face-to-face, just to go around the country and support. Yeah.
Well, clearly, as from what you said, that there is a definite need for support for those who are involved in bivocational ministry. But what would you say is the future then of that type of ministry, of being bivocational? Is there a future? Do you see it growing?
It is growing. It is the future. In fact, many denominations are waking up to that fact, that this is coming, this is growing. In fact, this is really positive, particularly for church planting. It is really positive. So I did allude to the statistics both here and in the US. There's also conversation in the, from my research, there's conversations within the Baptist church within this country that bivocational ministry, in fact, the conversation is intensifying. And also the New Frontiers, I've done in my reading and my research, they are having more intense conversations around it as a way forward. And another thing that I should also highlight was that where previously people went into bivocational ministry mainly because of financial reasons, now there is a trend of what I describe in literature as intentional bivocationalism, where people choose to do it whether or not the church can meet their salary. They actually do it because they feel called to do this type of ministry. So it's actually escalating. If you look at the statistics, as I've said, currently they are going upwards rather than downwards. And more churches are warming up to the idea of having a pastor who's also engaged in business or doing other things. So it is on the increase, it is on the rise. And with the work that organizations like ourselves and other people talking about it, it's going to become very normal. It's going to become very normal. And if anything, all we are doing is we are fulfilling the mission of God on earth. So it's not determined by what do you do outside. It is determined by what we do in terms of serving God and loving people. So yes, that's the message I would say. It's coming, and churches have to be prepared for it. In fact, plan for it, and hence why we have this consultancy activity that we have supporting church to be geared up for that. Also, theological. I'm actually working with the Theological Institute here in the UK to start to build in their training and development. So yeah, there is a recognition that this is the way forward. Of course, we will always have ministers who will always be minister. Because some of the things, when I have these conversations, I've realized that some people become a little bit uncomfortable until they realize that I'm not saying the other way of doing ministry is wrong. And they say, all right, so that's what you mean. We're not about that. We do recognize that there should be ministers who are just predominantly doing that. I mean, it depends on your calling and your circumstance. So it is intensifying.
Well, it certainly sounds that there's a definite future and a definite need for this style of ministry. We're almost coming to the end of our time, but I just want to give you an opportunity now to address the viewer directly and let them know what you would like to say about Bivo support.
Thank you, Ryan. So in closing, what I would want to get out there to you, our viewers, I would like to address Christians, really, any Christian, that you might feel you are called. Obviously, you would have your own local support from your ministers, from your ministry leaders, but there is additional support that we do offer for people who are trying to find their feet, really, that I feel called, but I do have other things going on. What do I do with that? So we are there to guide and support. A lot of what we do is actually theologically rooted. So obviously we use the Bible as our basis of what we do. I also want to speak to ministers who are bivocational themselves. I know it can get lonely. I mean, it depends where you're located. It depends what denomination. You might be an independent ministry. So we do have platforms. In fact, after these few months, you're going to see a lot of things coming out, because we are not idle. We are working behind the scenes as it stands. I mean, the lockdown is actually in a way accelerated us to do things more, which we had planned ahead, say, a few years. So there's going to be a lot of self-help supports on our website. There will also be lots of engagement with denominations. So at this point in time, I'm addressing denominational leaders who have ministers who are bivocational. You probably don't know how to support them. You probably need a bit more understanding yourself from somebody or from people who have walked the walk, but who also have a theoretical and theological basis for it, who are trained in training other people. So we are there to support denominational leaders. If you just need some guidance, we are there, but also to Bible College educationalists. I've said this before. We are there to support you in building curriculums that really meet the standard at every level, really, undergraduate, postgraduate, master's level, we can support with that. So, I mean, in closing, if you see a bivocational minister out there, please do support them. They really need the support. We have talked about the challenges, but they need your support, or rather, we need your support. So that's my closing statement today. And I want to thank all the viewers who will engage with this broadcast, and particularly thank you, Ryan, for taking your time and reaching out so that we can have this wonderful conversation.
Well, Hartness, it was really good to have you. I do wish you every blessing with all your endeavours. I pray that God will meet all your needs. And it's an important part. I imagine that God wants to put his stamp of authority and approval upon this, because it's working for him at the end of the day. And to our viewers, I hope you found this as interesting and as beneficial as I have. I want to thank you all for tuning in, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.